Cuddling facts that you wish you never knew. Part 22. In the 18th century, you could bring your cat or dog to the London Zoo and actually pay your admission by feeding it to the lions. Bus seats are specifically designed so you can't tell how dirty they really are. When an octopus reproduces, it removes its penis and throws it at the female so she can impregnate herself, and then he grows back another one. Oysters are actually alive when they're served. They don't die until you eat them. In Australia, there's a plant called the gimbi, which has such a severe sting that when horses brush up against it, they actually throw themselves off a cliff because they would rather die than experience the pain. Live chat support agents can see what you type before they send it so they can reply quicker. Spider rain, yes, you heard me right, is a real and naturally occurring phenomenon.
What are some of the craziest things people have confessed to in their final moments? In this series, I'm sharing the wildest ones I could find. And I cover lots of true crime and spooky stuff on this page, so follow along. In 1867, the body of 18-year-old Christine Kett was found in her parents' kitchen. No one had any idea who had done it, but there were a few clues found by her, like the fact that it was her brother's pistol that was found next to her body. But then, the autopsy showed that Christine's wounds were not consistent with that kind of weapon. There were also these tracks found outside of the house and on the fence, making it look like it was someone who came from the outside in. But despite all that, this case went unsolved for 17 years, until someone confessed to doing it with their last breath. It turns out that her mother had lost her mind while Christine was taking too long to cook dinner. She went at her with an axe and then put her own son's weapon next to her daughter's body to implicate him in the crime. If you've been enjoying the series, then you'll love the whole episode I did on it on my podcast.
This is Mary Wilson. She was born in County Durham in the late 1800s. She married her first husband, John Knowles, in the early 1910s, and they remained married for over 40 years. John Knowles died in 1955 after being ill for roughly a year. 5 months after his death, Mary married her lover, John Russell. John Russell died in 1956 after being ill for roughly a week. Mary was left with a £42 inheritance from both deaths, which is around £1,000 today. Mary married again in September 1956. Her third husband, Oliver Leonard, died the following month in October 1956. Mary was left with £50, which is around £1,200 today. She married again on October 28, 1957, and her new husband died 15 days later on November 12, 1957. Post-mortems later found traces of phosphorus in all the men's bodies. Mary was sentenced to death on March 29, 1958, but her sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. She died on January 10, 1963. For more on this case, check out my British Murders podcast. It's the 4th episode of Season 3, link in bio.
Let's talk about the Barbie and Ken killers. Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka met at a bar in Canada in 1987. They got married just 2 months later, and over the course of nearly 3 years, murdered at least 3 teenage girls. The first victim was Carla's little sister Tammy, who the couple drugged with animal tranquilizers, raped, and tortured to death. The second was 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey, who the couple brutally tortured and sexually abused before strangling Leslie and cutting her body up into little pieces and placing them into concrete blocks. The third victim, Kristen French, was abducted in 1992 and her naked body was found just 4 days later by police. This eventually led to the couple's arrest and both of them to be charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Carla was given a 12-year sentence, whereas Paul was given life in prison because Carla actually testified against him in court. Carla has been out of jail for a few years and is now married to her attorney's brother and has 3 children.
I want to talk about one of the worst accidents to ever happen on a film set, because this moment made the final cut of the movie. So this moment's coming from The Wizard of Oz, which already has a whole list of horrible things that happened on set, which is why I made an entire podcast episode about its dark history. In this shot, it looks like the Wicked Witch disappears behind a giant fireball. To do this stunt, the Wicked Witch was supposed to jump on this platform, which would take her underneath the stage so she could jump off the platform and then the fireball would erupt. But if you watch closely, you can see the timing's off. The platform starts going down before she's on it, meaning that this fireball erupted before she had time to get off the platform. This caused her hat and her head to catch fire, which led to 2nd and 3rd degree burns all over her face and body. But the worst part of all is that this makeup she's wearing is copper-based, meaning that even when they put the fire out on her face, the copper in the makeup was so hot it continued to melt her skin. And the only thing they had on set to take off the makeup and not infect the burns was rubbing alcohol. Some of the cast said that they remembered hearing her screams from below the stage, not because of the fire, but because of the rubbing alcohol that was being scrubbed into her burns. There is way more dark history to The Wizard of Oz, including more toxic makeup, so make sure you listen to the episode to hear more.
Whatever you're doing, stop scrolling, because this might just be one of the most compelling Skinwalker videos I've ever seen. Check it out.
Look, track him. There's 2 more black dots. Cody. How do you turn this on? Oh, what the crap? Is that a guy? What the frick?
What the fuck?
What was that?
He's walking creepy.
Dude, that was a skinwalker. What?
Follow him.
I videoed it. What the frick?
So what do you guys think? Was this just a person? Some sort of animal? Or could this have been a skinwalker?
10-year-old vanished while out hunting with his granddad, and what has happened is shocking. Wyatt Eves Nibbert from West Virginia had gone out squirrel hunting with his granddad on the 9th of September. Wyatt and his granddad were apparently eating lunch, and Wyatt said he was going off to look for some squirrels. His granddad apparently remained where he was and tidied up. He then called out for the boy, and apparently Wyatt never came. The granddad couldn't find him, and then an hour after the boy had gone missing, police responded to a vehicle accident involving the granddad. Tragically, the boy was found dead days after this. He was found deceased with a single gunshot wound. Police have not yet stated whether they suspect foul play.
This is the scariest song in the world, and here's why. Okay, so we all heard this song before, especially if you're into scary things and watch the Insidious movies. But do you know the very disturbing and chilling backstory behind this song? Well, the song is called Tiptoe Through the Tulips, and it was recorded and released in 1968 by American singer Tiny Tim. And when the song was first released, it didn't have the scary reputation it has now. However, this would change during his last ever live performance of the song. On September 28, 1996, Tiny Tim suffered a heart attack that was pretty miniature while performing at a music festival. And after this happened, his doctors advised him that he wasn't healthy enough to perform on stage anymore. However, Tiny Tim ignored the advice from his doctors and scheduled another concert at a women's club in Minnesota the next month. But right before his performance, he told his wife that he wasn't feeling that good. Nevertheless, Tiny Tim decided to go on stage anyway. And after performing the last song of the night, he suffered a major heart attack on stage and died in front of the crowd. And the song he was performing was Tiptoe Through the Tulips. This song was already terrifying, but it's 100 times more terrifying after knowing this. Now listen to it again after knowing this.
Seven-year-old Malachi was killed after being hit by a taxi while he was walking the streets of Bradford alone in the dark. So why was this 7-year-old boy alone in the dark on the streets of Bradford? Malachi's mother, Wendy Hall, who was 33, had left him in that house by himself while she went to visit her boyfriend for the night. It was a house that they'd previously lived in, so Malachi was familiar with it. They'd recently moved out to go and stay with Wendy's sister, but had gone back to pick up some belongings. Wendy intended to take Malachi to stay with her boyfriend for the night, but Malachi changed his mind and said he wanted to stay there. Instead of staying there with him or refusing to let him stay in a cold house and taking him back to her sister's, she left him in that house alone at 10 o'clock at night with no gas and no electric, and she went to stay at her boyfriend's house. She left him her phone so he could play on games while she was away. She locked the door behind her, but Malachi shortly after that got up, unlocked the deadbolt and went to find his mum. He was walking the streets of Bradford in the dark when he was hit by a taxi. He died at the scene and police found Wendy's mobile phone in his pocket. They managed to trace Wendy to her boyfriend's house to let her know that her son had died, and she had to go to the hospital to identify his body. The only defence that she had for the police was that she didn't think Malachi could unlock the door. She gave no excuses for why she left him there by himself. Prosecutors said that this was a deliberate disregard for the welfare of Malachi, a deliberate decision to leave him in that house with no gas or electric. She pleaded guilty to neglect, and on the 13th of April 2023, she was sentenced to just 5 years in prison. She will have to live with the fact that that decision that night led to the death of her son.
This case is absolutely sickening. This mother murdered 6 of her children by intentionally starting a house fire. It was the 7th of July 1992, and the fire service was called to a house fire in East Baltimore. They responded to the horrific scene and found the bodies of 4 children in the inferno. 2 children who had been rushed to hospital eventually died from their injuries. The children's mother, Tonya Lucas, was apparently due to be evicted from the house that morning. Witnesses testified that she bought and used a huge amount of the substance CC prior to the blaze. She'd also been undertaking S work in order to afford the substance. It was clear that her one child, Gregory Cook, who was only 2 years old, was a victim of abuse leading up to the fire due to him apparently resembling a skeleton. The medical examiner determined that the children's deaths were due to smoke inhalation. They were all determined to be homicides. A witness actually testified that Tonya had told him she was going to set her house on fire because of the pending eviction. She apparently was under the impression that a charity would provide her with a house if her house was to go up in flames. A witness watched the mother squirt some liquid in the lounge and callously start the fire. Now, some believe that Tonya is innocent, however, she has recently admitted to these crimes. She's had several trials relating to this case and served 23 years in prison. Her previous conviction was overturned on a technicality and 2 trials ended in hung juries. She has now accepted a plea deal on 1 count of arson and 6 counts of murder. She's been resentenced to life in prison, taking into account the time that she's already served, and has now been placed on probation.
This man claims to have seen his deceased sister. He says that 3 nights ago, he suddenly woke up, and what he saw terrified him. He said that when he looked up, he saw his sister sitting at the foot of his bed, just smiling at him. The only thing was, his sister died 6 years ago from a drug overdose. He says he was so in shock that he was just staring at her. He said that she was almost transparent. Suddenly, as he was looking into her eyes, they turned black. He said that he turned as fast as he could to his lamp and turned on the light, and when he looked back, she was gone. He said that this all happened in probably about 5 to 8 seconds. Afterwards, he woke up his wife and told her what happened. He was in tears. He couldn't stop crying. He said that his wife checked the foot of his bed, and she told him that it was still warm, as if someone had been sitting on it. He says he knows what he saw and that he wasn't dreaming. And he doesn't know if this was really the ghost of his sister or if it was something pretending to be her. He said that he's lived in the same house for about 2 years now, and they haven't had any paranormal experiences that he can remember. He says the only thing that's different now is that his wife is pregnant, and ever since she's been pregnant, he's been having strange dreams of his sister. This was just the first time that he saw her when he wasn't sleeping. He says that most of the dreams have been pleasant up until this moment. In his dreams, he'll just hear his sister singing like she used to, and he'll also have dreams of them playing soccer like they used to when they were kids. So what do you think this means? Could this have been the ghost of his deceased sister? Or do you think that this was something pretending to be her? Let me know in the comments down below.
This pedophile funeral director invited another man to come smoke meth and abuse a corpse with him in a funeral home in England. This story is extremely disturbing, so viewer discretion is advised. Meet Nigel Robinson Wright, who was 42 at the time of his arrest. So online, Nigel had a completely different life than in person. In the real world, Nigel was overseeing funerals and helping people deal with the process of death and grief. But online, Nigel frequented pedophile chat rooms. He egged people on who were essaying animals. He chatted with people about his arousal with dead bodies. And he even offered to show up to a man's house who offered him his own toddler to abuse. So these chats eventually got so extreme that they were turned over to the police. And when the police went to Nigel's house, they confiscated all of his electronic devices, and that's where they found some very disturbing things. There were all sorts of different pornographic videos found on Nigel's devices. Videos that involved animals, dogs, children, and yes, corpses. So Nigel was seeking out all of this violent, extreme material on the internet and even commissioning other users to create this content for him. And in those chats, the authorities discovered Nigel and an acquaintance talking about their previous time spent in the funeral home that Nigel managed. Yes, some of these chats were extremely graphic and involved doing things with dead bodies that humans should never be doing. And they talked about how they had done other things all throughout the funeral home, in the chapel, on the benches, everywhere. So at the end of the day, Nigel was sentenced to 17 years in prison. I don't think that's nearly long enough of a sentence, but yeah, he's gonna be out, in a decade or so. And judging by this dude's twisted mind and his past on the internet, I definitely don't think it's gonna be safe to have him back out in society. The story of the plane crash after 9/11 on November 12th, 2001 is scary for multiple reasons. So let's talk about it. This is American Airlines Flight 587. Yes, this is the exact plane that crashed into the ground. So on November 12th, 2001, this flight took off from JFK Airport in New York. On board that day were 260 people. There were 251 passengers and 9 crew members. Now, this happened literally 2 months and a day after 9/11, so people were already very afraid of what was happening in the skies. But essentially, a number of errors within the crew of the plane and the turbulence they were hitting led to the plane making a sharp dive. Basically, the vertical stabilizer on the plane failed, which caused the plane to, like I said, dive. It punched downwards into a spin, and it crashed in a neighborhood in New York. So 5 people who were on the ground died as a result of this crash, who I assume were just hanging out in their houses since this plane crashed into a neighborhood. And all 260 people on board the plane perished as well. So obviously, since this happened so close to 9/11, people claim that this might have been a terrorist attack. There were massive investigations launched by the United States government, other governments, and some people even came forward and claimed that they had something to do with the attack. But eventually it was determined that it was just this combination of mistakes, turbulence, other things that went into all of this that caused the plane to go down. But remember at the beginning of the story that I said that this was really scary? Well, obviously a plane crash out of nowhere is terrifying, but here's the kicker. So on that morning, November 12th, 2001, New Jersey's lottery had a pick 3 drawing. People could pick any 3 numbers, and then, that was the day that they were determining which numbers would win. Well, on that day, both of the drawings that happened, one in the morning and one at night, contained the numbers of the doomed flight. The morning drawing was 578, and the drawing at night was 587. Now, I don't really believe in coincidences, and I don't know how that would possibly relate to all of this, but you cannot deny that a plane crash that happens a state over seemed to be predicted by that lottery drawing. I mean, flight 587 and they draw 578 and 587, that is just too weird to be a coincidence.
After the events involving Jason Voorhees at Pinehurst Halfway House, Camp Crystal Lake was renamed Forest Green. Tommy Jarvis returned to Forest Green with his friend Alan, in the hopes that they would cremate Jason's body. Tommy hoped that would finally end his hallucinations. They dug up Jason's body from the cemetery, but Tommy had a flashback of murdering Jason when he saw his body. Tommy snapped and stabbed Jason's corpse with a metal fence post. Lightning then struck the metal post and revived Jason. Jason then killed Alan and retrieved his hockey mask, which Tommy had brought with him to the cemetery. Tommy made his way to the sheriff's office but was arrested. Sheriff Garris, who was well aware of Tommy's mental problems, ignored his warning that Jason had returned. Soon after, councillors Darren and Lisbeth got lost looking for the camp and ran into Jason. He promptly killed them using the metal post that had resurrected him. The following day, Sheriff Garris's daughter Megan, her friends Sissy and Court, and Lisbeth's sister Paula asked him to search for the missing pair. Tommy warned them about Jason, but as usual he was ignored. Jason then stumbled across a corporate paintball game in the woods. He proceeded to kill every player and took their equipment. Jason soon realised his newfound strength as he ripped off one of the paintballer's arms by accident. The campers then arrived at Forest Green, whilst the councillors did their best to run it without Darren and Lisbeth. Sheriff Garris then attempted to escort Tommy out of his jurisdiction, due to his influence on Megan as she developed a crush on him. Tommy briefly escaped and ran to Jason's grave, but the caretaker had covered it up. Alan's body was now in Jason's place. Tommy was then escorted out of town. That night, Jason murdered the caretaker and a nearby couple who witnessed the murder. Court and a girl named Nikki were then killed by Jason. Sheriff Garris's deputies then found the bodies of the victims, and he immediately implicated Tommy in the murders. Tommy then contacted Megan and convinced her to help him lure Jason back to Camp Crystal Lake. He didn't realise that Jason had already made his way back to the camp and killed Sissy and Paula. He then killed Sheriff Garris and 2 of his deputies. After arriving at the camp with Tommy, Megan was confronted by Jason. Just as he was about to kill her, Tommy called to him from the lake. Jason left Megan, opting instead to go for his killer, Tommy. Jason then attacked Tommy in a boat in the middle of the lake, but Tommy managed to secure a chain around Jason's neck which was attached to a boulder. Jason jumped onto Tommy and snapped the boat in half. dragging Tommy to the bottom of the lake with him. Jason then strangled Tommy underwater before letting his body float to the surface. Whilst trying to recover Tommy's body, Megan had her leg grabbed by Jason. She then turned the boat's motor on and sliced Jason's throat with it. Back on shore, Tommy was successfully revived by Megan after she used CPR. You may be wondering if Jason died after all that. Comment for part 7 and I'll let you know. You might not believe it, but this story gets even weirder. You've got to love Jason, haven't you?
What? Nothing there, mate. Nothing there. What? There's nothing there.
This man got dissected on camera for killing a gang member in Pakistan. This video began going around the internet in late 2021. The video was shot in Pakistan and the gory nature behind the video absolutely shocked the country. The backstory behind the video suggests that the victim, who people referred to as Ramesh, was a worker at a cement factory and was accused of doing a contract killing of a man named Arun, who was likely part of some gang. He did it for 1.5 million rupees, which equals 18,000 USD. The victim was accused of cutting off the hand and nose of Arun before killing him. The video that I'm about to explain was recorded for locals to show what happens if you mess with their gang. The video is 2 minutes and 12 seconds long, and the setting is in some sort of desert area. As you play the video, you see the victim sitting on the ground, and it looks like he's already been beaten since there's blood all over his shirt. A man can then be seen standing over him, grabbing his head aggressively. He's doing this while talking to the victim and accusing him of murdering Arun. The interrogation lasts for about 45 seconds, and throughout you can see the victim grimacing in pain, which is most likely from the torture he went through before the video was recorded. And based off the victim's reaction, he already accepted his fate. He doesn't plead or beg for his life, he just has a hopeless expression on his face, and it's just disturbing. The man interrogating him is wearing a brown robe and a bunch of combat pouches. And after 45 seconds, the interrogator pulls the victim to the ground and lays him on his back. As he pulls out a long combat knife, he then kneels down next to the victim and grabs his left arm and proceeds to cut into the victim's elbow and cuts deep into the joints. The victim screams out in pain and lets out a couple of groans. The knife is slicing through the joints and skin extremely quickly. And once the flesh has been cut, the killer then twists the victim's arm back and forth, and it makes a horrifying crunching noise that you would never unhear. The killer then cuts the remaining flesh off the arm and rips it off the victim's body. The victim then looks at his stump, and his expression is pure shock and fear. And he continues to make light groaning and crying sounds throughout. The same process is then repeated on the victim's right arm, and the killer slices and hacks into it before ripping it off, just as he did to his left arm, and somehow after losing liters of blood in both of his arms, the victim is still alive and conscious. The killer then kneels down next to the victim's face and begins following the exact steps that the victim killed Harun with. He brings the knife to the victim's face and cuts off the tip of his nose. And you can see the victim close his eyes and wince in pain as this happens. The killer then proceeds to cut both of the victim's ears off in a matter of seconds, while casually throwing the severed ears on the ground next to him. The killer then stops and looks at the camera and says, "This is what happens when you go against the Ladi gang." And the video then concludes. There is apparently an extended version of the video showing the victim getting his throat slit right after this happened, which killed him, but I couldn't find it. This video is extremely graphic and has actually been circulating again on various platforms and gore websites. But I advise you not to watch it or go looking for it due to its extreme graphic nature. Please take my word for it, it's honestly horrible.
This schoolboy stabbed his teacher to death in front of a classroom full of students. 61-year-old Anne Maguire was a Spanish teacher teaching in Leeds. She'd actually worked at the school for 40 years and she was only 5 months off retirement. However, in April 2014, something absolutely horrific happened. One of her students was 15-year-old Will Cornick. He'd always been described as a smart student who never really caused any trouble. Classmates regarded him as a polite student, but after he got diagnosed with diabetes, his personality seemed to change. In 2013, he tried to join the army, but because of his diagnosis, he was rejected. Being in the army had been his dream, so this was really upsetting for him. After failing to complete his Spanish homework, he was given detention by Anne. He also expressed a wish to her that he wanted to drop Spanish, but she wouldn't let him, which only angered him more. He began to develop a deep-rooted grudge against Anne. Shockingly, he reportedly messaged his friends on Facebook asking if one of them would kill her for him for £10. During one school day, halfway through his Spanish class, Will decided to get up and attack Anne with a knife. The classmates watched on in horror as he chased her out of the classroom. When there, another teacher heard her screams and tried to shield Anne from any more blows from him. Will then allegedly returned to his class and told his classmates how it was a shame that he hadn't killed her. However, Anne did actually pass away from her injuries. Will later admitted that he did plan also to kill 2 other teachers. One of them was actually pregnant at the time. He's been sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 20 years. Mysterious case absolutely does not sit right with me. Someone knows something and has not come forward. On the 12th of July 2015, 18-year-old Tiffany and her parents attended a graduation party in New Jersey. At around 9 p.m, one of Tiffany's friends spoke to her parents and claimed that they were really annoyed because Tiffany had used their debit card without permission. Tiffany initially denied this to her friend, but then did admit this to her mum Diane a little bit later. At this point, they were all outside Tiffany's house, and Diane went inside to find her husband. When she returned outside of the house, Tiffany had vanished. Now, they were able to see Tiffany on the deer cameras that they had outside the house. She appears to be walking down the driveway in her normal clothing and white headband. When they tried to find Tiffany, they actually made a terrifying discovery. Her phone was lying on the floor at the bottom of the driveway. Immediately, they knew something was wrong, as Tiffany never had her phone out of her sight. At 11:30 p.m, her family called the police. Little did they know, 27 minutes earlier, Tiffany had been hit by a train. Frustratingly, pretty much straight away, police presumed this death to be a self-unaliving. However, that just didn't seem to fit with the evidence presented. All of Tiffany's family and friends said how much of an upbeat person she was and that she was really happy at the time. She was making plans for the future, and the autopsy also showed that she had a clean toxicology report. Now, in the deer cam footage, she was fully clothed, but when she was found, she was just in her underwear with no shoes on. Upsettingly, 2 weeks after her death, Tiffany's mum actually found her missing trainers and headband more than a mile away from the tracks. Could someone have murdered Tiffany and then dumped her body on the train tracks to make it look like she did this herself? Tiffany's parents certainly think so. They definitely suspect some foul play was involved. This case made me terrified to go to the cinema. This is the case of the horror in Screen 9. James Holmes was raised in California. His mum was a nurse and his dad was a scientist. From a young age, he was experiencing night terrors and allegedly actually tried to take his own life when he was just 11 years old. He was apparently obsessed with guns and weapons and had dreamed of becoming a mass murderer. Between May and July 2012, he legally bought 4 guns. Background checks were conducted and he was allowed the weapons. He also bought spike strips, which, if you don't know, pop the tyres of cars if they chase after you. On July the 19th, just hours before tragedy would unfold, James mailed his notebook to his psychiatrist. Inside the notebook, James detailed his plans to kill. The notebook was actually discovered later on undelivered. Just prior to entering a cinema in Aurora, James rang a crisis line to tell them about his plans to kill. However, the call was disconnected after just 9 seconds. At the midnight showing of The Dark Knight Rises, CCTV captures James walking into the cinema. He walks into Screen 9, props open the door, and then walks back out again. Shockingly, he goes to his car and gets guns out and gas canisters. He re-entered the screen at about 12:38 p.m. and set off 2 gas canisters. When he entered Screen 9 again, he immediately opens fire on the audience, instantly killing 10 people. 2 others later died in hospital from their injuries. An additional 70 people were injured. This was an absolutely packed out cinema. James also shot at people as they scrambled to exit the screen. His youngest victim was a 6-year-old girl. Witnesses said this all unfolded as there was actually a gunfight on the screen, and initially they all thought it was special effects and just part of the film. Police were actually on the scene very quickly after the first 911 call. James surrendered to the police and was arrested in the car park. He was apparently very calm when he was arrested and told police that he had booby-trapped his apartment. When police investigated his apartment, this was found out to be true. He was sentenced to 12 consecutive life sentences.